Thank you for being here this morning. Welcome. I'm excited to kick off the third part of our series on schools as living systems. And today we're going to be talking about reflecting on your progress. So to get started, I know there's some people that have been here for the first two webinars, and thanks for coming back for the third one. That's great. If you could just put in the chat again where you're from and your role in your school district, that would be great. Oh, there's some Emily's in San Diego. Thank you. Even if you're not in a school district, I know we have some of our account executives on the call as well. If you just want to share your name and your region, and that would be great as well. Oh, there were some repeats. So wonderful. So I'm going to just jump in and get started for today. Thank you so much for everybody that is joining us. I see coordinator, Department of EL coordinator, technology department. Wonderful. Thank you for being here. And Jordan's back again. Thank you, Jordan, for being here. Great. Well, I'm really excited. And today, as I said, we're going to be continuing with our series and moving forward with spiral model for change. This is just a real quick introduction to me, who I am. I've been in public education for 15 years, for 20 years at this point, and I'm very excited to be talking about education technology and models for change. I'm very passionate about education technology. It's been my goal for districts to be using technology in meaningful ways for a long time now. So I'm thrilled to be sharing this work. As I started with the first session, I talked about a traditional technology planning model. And this is one way that many districts approach technology planning. It is a very valuable way to look at things. It's a more technical way than what I'm going to be building on today. We're going to be talking about a spiral model for change. This is really starting with a vision and bringing you through a process where you plan a budget and a rotation cycle. It's a more linear process than what we're going to be doing, but there's great value in this process as well. This is a more traditional process. So I'm going to be talking about a spiral model for change, and this is really a systems approach to scaling pedagogical innovation in your school districts. And we start with invitation and discovery, and that's where we really focused on March 2nd. We then moved last week to collective maturation and sponsorship, and we talked about what that looked like for our system and how we really support the teachers that are doing the work of the initiatives that we're starting. And then today we're really going to look at engaging the subsystems. So who are those people that we haven't maybe spoken to? How do we engage them in the conversation? And then also suspending complexity. Because as we roll out initiatives, we tend to get bogged down in the things that don't work, the things that make the work or the hurdles of our work, right? Things that trip us up, or scheduling, things like that, that get us bogged down in the details of any initiative in a school system. So we're going to talk about how do we suspend complexity for a bit, and instead, how do we actually embrace the complexity of our work? I do have a guide for the webinar today, and it builds on the last 2 weeks. So Camille, if you could please share that in the chat, that would be great. There it is. So I'll refer to this as we go through, and it will help you sort of frame the conversation that we're having. And also my hope is that you can use this back in your districts, and you can bring this back and use it with a team that you pull together. So here's the webinar series. We started on March 2nd with initiating the technology planning process. Last week, we talked about balancing advocacy and inquiry and how we support the change for the people that have joined us on this journey. And today we're really going to look at taking a breath, pausing, and reflecting on our progress. And what are some of the strategies that we can use for that process? So again, I like to start with learning outcomes, and I hope that by the end of the session, you will be able to apply a strategy to determine if your work is yielding results, be able to identify the collective experience of your technology leadership team, and be able to facilitate the dialogue with multiple constituencies to actually name what is happening as a result of the initiative. In our first session on March 2nd, I shared the results of the COSIN Innovation Survey that was done earlier this year. And we talked about some hurdles, accelerators, and tech enablers that we were experiencing. And then I shared some that, the ones that actually COSIN named in the survey. And this webinar series is really designed to look at the hurdle that they've named with scaling innovation and the inertia of education systems. So what happened as a result of our experience in the pandemic, and how do we reflect on that, take what was great and really worked and changed and impacted what we were doing for our students, and how do we scale that innovation, and how do we overcome that typical inertia that we see and feel in our education systems, and how do we keep moving forward and build on the successes we may have seen. And then also accelerators, building the human capacity of leaders and looking at how do we support our teachers as leaders. And so we'll continue to really focus on those two areas as well today. I always like to start with an opening question, and you'll find this opening question today on page 1 of the webinar guide that we shared with you earlier. And as your work progresses, remember to ask yourself the same question again and again and again. We've been talking about a spiral model for change, and certainly as we use the same question, our responses will change, and we will be continuously focused on the outcome that we were originally, creating the initiative to achieve, but it allows us to really stay on track and record what might have changed. So what is it you want to pay attention to? And what question can you ask to help you define your initiative and what it is you really want to achieve? So I'll give you an example of this. When I first started using this model, I worked with a team of teachers and a technology leadership team, and we had received a grant from the US Department of Education, an innovation grant we had received. And so we put together the initiative to create technology-rich learning environments to support project-based learning. And we really wanted to measure or pay attention to what was happening with our students as we introduce the technology. For me, it was super important to see how the team was using the technology and how it changed their approach to lesson planning and to their engagement with the students. So I used a model for inquiry that Bybee had identified, that 5E inquiry-based instructional model. Camille, could you please share the link for that in the chat? It's a model that I've used, and it really looks at engage, explore, explain, elaborate, and evaluate. So we used this inquiry process to really define how we were engaging in the challenging work and how we were engaging our students in the challenging work. So we were using this model both for the kids and for ourselves. Explore, team members chose a problem to investigate. And we talked about that last week with creating those containers where people could experiment on their own and creating those containers for inquiry. So what was the problem that the team members were choosing to explore and investigate in terms of their own instruction? Then explain. Team members had an opportunity to explain what they were doing and the outcomes as a result of what they had learned, the new knowledge that they had gained as a result of being able to use the technologies in different ways and to have the time to create these investigations for themselves. And then elaborate. Team members apply their knowledge in new situations and pay attention to the outcomes from applying it in those new situations. And then, of course, extending it out to their colleagues in the school district and to the other members of the team, and really being able to see if it can be applied in different settings. And then ultimately evaluate. Team members reflected on their knowledge and the learning process, and really using metacognition to come back to the whole process. So for me, that's what I wanted to pay attention to during the process. You will have your own question that you'll want to pay attention to, and your own markers also. So it's important to name what it is you want to pay attention to as a part of this process. So I just want to provide the context for the work again. And digital learning technologies are widely regarded as an enabler of a core mission, but also I believe that they're a marker of innovation in a district. And it's one way to assess pedagogical innovation and really plan to progress along those three dimensions: pedagogical, technological, and organizational. So again, this is the spiral model for change I referenced earlier. And today we'll be building on the first two areas that we investigated. We started with invitation and discovery in terms of plotting a strategic journey. And we looked at ourselves and how we step into our role as leaders. And then really identifying the characteristics of who we want to invite, the teachers that we want to invite as a part of the process. We defined the characteristics that we wanted: growth mindset, curiosity, being reflective, and also making sure that our team was representative of our learning community as a whole. So you had teachers from your high schools, your elementary schools, your middle schools, special education teachers, an administrator. So really looking at who is a part of our learning community and who we should invite. Discovery: what is driving you to seek the change, and coming to consensus on that, and identifying the potentials for to which you aspire as a system, and how to begin to move toward those potentials. Then last week, we talked about collective maturation and a sponsorship container. So what are you as a leader doing to seed the ground, to not just invite people, but also what are you doing to actively engage people to kick off this work and start this work? How do you balance advocacy and inquiry, and who you're inviting to your team? And then what containers for inquiry do you need to create and or support for those people that have joined you in this work? Today, we're looking at embracing the complexity of this work. There's a lot of moving parts because you're not controlling what's happening in the classrooms. So you have to really believe in your team and relinquish that control. So we'll talk about relinquishing that control a bit and embracing all of the things that can happen as a result of what you've put in place previously. I'll share a strategy to sort of document the collective experience of the team, and then also talk about a couple strategies you can use to engage the subsystems in the conversation. People that you may not have invited, but now need to go and circle back and engage in those conversations now that things are actually starting to happen. So first, we're going to look at, as I said, reflecting and identifying, is our work yielding results? As a leader, you need to suspend control and make space for new perspectives, right? In this approach, leaders and team members suspend judgment and watch what is happening, and not be quick to jump in and solve a problem. Let's see how it goes, and don't judge the outcome. As a leader, some of the strategies that you can do is really engage in active listening in order to stay present and fully participate in the process, and be aware of how you can continue to support the teachers. You want to really enhance that central story of the team and the journey that you're taking together. You need to look at the perspective from different, you need to look at the initiative from different perspectives. So as an example, if I had continued to try to control what was happening in the classrooms, that this is the way the technology has to be used, instead of letting the teachers really identify what they wanted to do, what they were curious about, how they wanted to apply the different technologies to see how they impacted the learning environment, it would have been a very different outcome. They had an extraordinary commitment and enthusiasm for the initiative, and the outcomes would not have been the same if I hadn't relinquished the control. So I want to circle back to what we talked about last week, because it is a spiral model. We're always going back and picking up or building on what we've done previously. And last week we talked about what containers for inquiry do you need to create and or support. And I offered some examples of the different ones that I've created for myself in terms of monthly team meetings, the NICEGATE annual conference, and just being in communication with all the stakeholders in the district. So one of the things that we started to do as a part of our monthly meetings is I started to record the audio from the meetings, not the videos, because the video is distracting. But I wanted to have this because the work was being funded by a federal grant. I needed to do a report. So I wanted to have a way to go back and document the work that was being done, how we were doing it, and how we reflected on the outcomes. And I really wanted to be able to point to specific examples in the reports that I was doing for the federal government. So we started to record the audio. And it was interesting because after of course, I asked the teachers first if they were okay with having me record the sessions. And after we went through this a couple of times, they started to ask me if they could have the audio to listen to. So again, I was building transparency because I wanted them to have access to the same information I had. So to be transparent, I made the audio recordings available to any of them. And over time, they all started to ask for the recordings so that they could listen to them as well. So I have a sample of one of the recordings today, and I'd like to share that with you. And as you listen to the conversation, do you hear evidence of teacher reflection, collaboration, learning, and risk-taking? Because that's a big part of this process. So I'm going to play the audio, and then Camille put the poll up. Thank you. And so you can listen for evidence and check all the ones you can see.
I mean, I did a lab last chapter on alternative energy, and we were concentrating on wind turbines. So I talked about wind turbines. Then they took a note about a wind turbine. Under the note was a photograph of a wind farm. After that, I embedded a video clip of a wind farm in use where the scientists are talking about the wind farms. And the next day, I did a lab where I had a wind turbine connected to a meter, and we turned a fan on, and the turbine was spinning, and we could figure out how much electricity was generated. A week later, I asked the class, I said, raise your hand if you guys know what a wind turbine is. And only half was like crushed. And I was like, oh my God, I don't know what else I can do. They heard it, they saw it, they watched it, they did it. So it was a little disheartening. I guess they got a little frustrated. I said, you guys kidding me? I handed out a Post-it and I said, write down what a wind turbine is. And because I thought maybe kids were scared to raise their hand. And a little more than half knew what it was after all of that. So we are dealing with a big issue. It's not always things that we need to do better. Maybe I could have done it better, but there's a disconnect that we're dealing with. And not all my lessons are like that, but I really thought I get a wallop of a lesson this time. I was like, man, these kids know wind turbines. They're going to get up to Mike and he's going to ask them what a wind turbine is, and they're going to know. And a week later, a lot of them didn't remember. So I'm thinking to myself, that's a huge, to me, that was a huge indicator. And if I just kind of like told them what it was and made them copy a note on it, I would expect maybe half of them would remember a week later. But after all of that, and it was a 2-day lab, and everybody got to test the wind turbines, and I must have said turbine 9,000 times. So I don't know really where I'm going with this story, but it was a little disheartening, you know, and I had to really think, well, in that particular lesson, I did the best I could. And, you know, that's, I don't know.
You felt that you even used technology in that case in the explanation stage of the cycle where you were actively, for the kids were actively using the technology to
Yes.
To experiment with a wind turbine and see what the result was.
They as a class, we designed the experiment. I had all the pieces up there and I said, so how are we going to do this? How are we going to set up the experiment? They told me use the fan to turn the turbine. They said hook the electric meter up to the generator in the turbine. They didn't know how to do that. I showed them how to do that, but we set up the experiment together. And just everything was really solid and really good. And I was observed on that. That was good. You know, as the kids had fun, and then a week later when I didn't know, I wouldn't think to do it. I was just like, hey, everybody, what's a wind turbine? And I'm like, no, what is it? And a lot of kids didn't know. So.
Or they couldn't articulate it.
Well, there's a lot of things as teachers, all of us can do better and keep doing, but the kids have to really meet us halfway a lot of times. And when they don't, we're up against a big challenge.
Well, that's what Mike always says, learning is hard.
Learning is really hard.
I was quoting Lucas when I said it.
Oh, okay.
I was. I really was.
Yeah,
But it's true that they, you have to pay attention. Because this is turning into a great session.
So I'm going to stop that now. And if you could just click on the poll and see if you heard any evidence of any of this: teacher reflection, collaboration, learning, and risk-taking, or risk-taking. Awesome. So all of them, right? So teacher reflection, collaboration, learning, and risk-taking, and definitely. That really was the objective of having these monthly meetings. And they began to take on this structure where we were sharing the work that we were doing, we were reflecting on it. Whenever I share this, people say that the name of the teacher that was doing most of the talking was Lucas. And they felt that he was very brave and that he must have felt safe in this environment to be able to share like that. And that was my goal all along, was to create a safe space where the teachers felt that they could share their frustrations, what they were struggling with, how they wanted to engage students. The other thing is, I used that inquiry model, Bybee's inquiry model, to reflect back on. So that kind of guided our reflections, because we wanted to name how we were using the technologies as a part of that inquiry process for ourselves as inquirers, and also in our lesson planning for our students. But it became a very powerful tool for us to use as a part of the reflection process. All right, so the next element of this part of the spiral model for change, we look at what is our collective experience. Again, we're looking at embracing the complexity of our work. And part of that build the history of our experience, both as a team, but also as an individual, and how we are engaging in this work now, but how we came to be in as a part of this team and also interested in doing this work. And then looking at the future of our system. So how do we move from where we were, where we are, and where we want to go? And on page 4, there is but let me circle back real quick. Again, we're talking about building on this as the spiral model for change. So this kind of goes back to, who did you invite and why did you invite them? What characteristics did they demonstrate? They're representative of your team. And last week we talked about having a balanced team in terms of advocacy and inquiry, and inviting those movers, followers, opposers, and bystanders that are in your system to be a part of the work. So the movers helping you initiate new ideas and really launch the work and dig into it. And they're super enthusiastic. The followers, those are the people that are going to jump on board because they're interested and they see what's happening. The opposers, the people that might be questioning some of the work that you're doing, but they also help you self-correct and stay on track and look at what's best for your learning system. And then the bystanders, who are likely going to agree and nod, or they're going to maybe provide a different insight than where you thought the work might be going. So by engaging all of these people in this work of naming what happened in terms of the world at large, your school system, your personal life, or the project in your team, and then your personal life. So using this to develop that story of how you got to where you are. And once you see that, then you can start to plan for what's next. So in this example, I laid it out in 10-year increments, starting in 2000, going through 2030, and thinking about, well, what was happening in the world at large in 2000, right? What was happening in our school system? What was happening with our project and our team? And what was happening with me and my life? So in 2000, the project and the team didn't exist. So we wouldn't be able to put anything for there. Many of the teachers that started the work as a part of the team, they weren't even in the school system at that time. So what was their life like? Where were they? It also speaks to the generation that they're a part of and how they view technology to be a part of this learning process. So I think that by mapping, by sharing this map and having the members of the technology leadership team, the people that are really deeply engaged in the work of the initiative, you can start to define that collective experience. You can look for trends. You can see what really supported them to move from where they were to where they are now, and what's informing their vision for the next step. And it really gives the team a good map for the work that's already been completed, but also for taking the next steps. And then the last part of this process, we look at what strategies you can use to engage the subsystems in the conversation. So there may be instances, and I have these questions 9 through 10 in the webinar guide. There may be constituencies that you didn't invite to be a part of the technology leadership team in terms of where you started and where you are. And who else do you have to go back to and speak to? Do you need to talk to students? What's their experience? And what is their experience with what's happening with the new initiative in the classrooms with the teachers that are a part of the leadership team? Are there stakeholder groups that you didn't consult at first? Other ones, should you talk to parents? Should you talk to community members? Should you invite additional administrators because maybe they're starting to get interested in the work? So who is it you should be speaking to now, and sort of painting a picture of what you're thinking about what's been going on? One of the strategies that I like to use as a part of this is actually naming what's happening as a result of the initiative. So for instance, when we went one-to-one with Chromebooks, we wanted to name what was happening. We wanted to be able to say, was this initiative successful or not, right? A lot of people were trying to answer that question. And it wasn't enough to say, yes, we're using Chromebooks, we're using the devices. Well, what does that really mean? You have to get very specific and name how the students, how the teachers are actually using the devices for instruction and for learning. So for example, instead of saying, well, the kids are using the Chromebooks, well, you might say that, yes, I've designed a lesson and the kids can now access Google Docs and they're creating shared presentations, or they're building hyperdocs about a lesson. That's their assignment now, to build hyperdocs, or to use a formative assessment tool to see what is to gauge the learning that's happening. So to do pre-class and post-class, right? So maybe you're using Pear Deck, maybe you're using a poll, whatever it is, you could use different technologies to really gauge what the student's learning is. So again, not specifically about the device, but about the learning that's happening as a result of having the devices, and really being very clear to name that. And that's a great thing to use when you're interviewing constituents that you haven't necessarily involved in the initiative from the beginning. So what do you see happening as a result of this work? And getting them to be very specific and naming what they see is happening. So again, this is, we've been talking about the past 3 weeks, the spiral model for change, and how this model really supports pedagogical innovation and takes a systems approach to scaling that innovation, going from a small, committed, central group of people, a core group of people, and being able to grow this work out so that it becomes a part of what we do. What happened with us with this particular, at this particular phase, people were really starting to reflect on their work. They were taking what they had done with one class and applying it to another class. They were also sharing it with their colleagues. So you started to see some of the lessons that they were doing and some of the strategies that they were using take root in other places in the district. And that was really exciting. These are some other guiding questions or kind of questions for reflection that I like to use. And I included these as question 11 in your guide. And I'll just run through them. In the middle of your journey, who do you message for help, encouragement, and reflection? Do you have somebody that you can call? That's kind of like a helpline for you. What have you been avoiding? Because a lot of times as you start to see things rolling out in an initiative, you don't necessarily want to dig into it. So is there anything that you've sort of noticed but have been avoiding? And what can't you see right now? Sometimes it's easy to name what you're seeing, but what are other things that might be going on? What is it you're curious about that you haven't really paid attention? Part of the work. Well, question 12 in your guide, I like to end with what steps have you taken to, and in this case, it's what steps have you taken or will you take to reflect on your progress? It's important to take that pause and look back to see what it took to get to where you are, and identify the next steps that you need in order to build on that work and move forward. And disruptive innovation rarely happens by chance, right? It requires planning. It's not a light bulb moment. It's important to lay that foundation, plot a strategic journey. You need to seed the ground for inquiry and take the time to pause and really embrace the complexities of the work that you're doing. A lot of it isn't necessarily visible immediately. And that's why reflection really helps you identify how you've been moving and the direction that you've been going in, and name what has been happening to date. So our next webinar for this series is next Thursday, March 23rd. And we're really going to be looking at sort of the culmination of the past 3 weeks. So how did we move from that core group of committed people that started the work with us, and where are we today in terms of making this a part of what we do? How do we move from talking about the technology to having the technology be a part of the learning and teaching that happens every day? Thank you for being here today. This is, as I said, the third in our series for schools as living systems, and looking at a different model for developing your organizational capacity for technology planning. I do have a QR code here in the middle that will take you to a feedback form. I'd love your feedback. And also we'll be sending out that link in the follow-up materials, which will include the link again to the webinar guide as well as to the recording. So thank you for being here. And if you have any questions and you want to put them in the chat, I'd be happy to take a look at them. And if not, I hope I see you all next week. Thank you